Today, we're joined by three pairs of speakers across generations and disciplines that address issues of sustainability in both Bhutan and Switzerland. Speakers, I'll introduce you all in a moment, but if you could put on your videos and wave to our audience today. Great. I'll introduce them more in a moment, but more about today's topic. These two countries, while sharing obvious topological features, like being some of the most mountainous regions in the world, also have a long shared history of mutual engagement. Their ties date back to the personal friendship between the third king, Jigme Dorje Wanchuk, and Swiss entrepreneur Fritz von Schultes, but have evolved into a wider cooperation in the area of development. Especially in recent years, climate change and the global pandemic has challenged sustainable development as we know it and destabilized traditional notions of economic value, environmental protection, and cultural preservation. In this conversation, we hope to delve deeper into what these challenges are and hope to learn from our speakers about the perspectives from both Bhutan and Switzerland about how they combat these issues. An hour and a half, of course, isn't a long time, but in this conversation, we hope to get just beneath the surface at least a little bit. We encourage you to ask questions in the chat, and my colleague Kalyan will be collecting those for us and getting us all sorted on that end. And if you have any questions, please write them in the chat and we'll make sure to get those sorted for you. So to begin our session off today, we wanted to share a Mentimeter question to kind of kick us off in a more interactive fashion. If you could visit the website menti.com and use this code listed here. Great. And we'll just get started with a quick survey question about notions of Bhutan and gross national happiness this afternoon. Thanks so much, Colleen. Give you all a moment to chime in. Great. And panelists, if you feel the need and desire to join Menti and to use the code to write down what you think of when it comes to Bhutan or gross national happiness. These are some fascinating insights coming in. Again, remember there's no right or wrong answer. This is really to gauge where our audience is at and where you are when you think about these issues and these terms. Maybe, Kalyan, if you could start the countdown for us. These are really some great perspectives. Fantastic. All right. So really, while understanding gross national happiness singularly is not the core of today's conversation, the goal of this is really to address some of these ideas and to start a conversation about them. So with that in mind, we'll be starting our first pair of speakers, Jane Carter and Wange Funso. If you could both turn on your videos. Great. Hi, Wange. Hi, Jane. You both could introduce yourselves to the audience here. A little bit about yourself, your name, your title, and then we'll get started on today's first pair of discussions.
Sure, who should go first?
Wange, if you could start us off.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Anne. Hi, everybody. Good evening from Bhutan. I'm Wange. I'm with the Gross National Happiness Commission Secretariat. Currently, I'm with the division that heads the review of all public policies in Bhutan. And one of the main tasks during the review of public policies is to ensure that they're aligned with our philosophy of Gross National Happiness Commission. I probably will talk to you more on that later. And about my commission, in addition to doing public policies, we are also the central planning agency. We do 5-year plans. We coordinate the formulation of all plans and ensure that they are well aligned to our international and national development goals, including GNH and SDGs. Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Kususampo to everybody in Bhutan. My name is Jane Carter. I'm the Senior Natural Governance Resource Advisor for Helvetis, based currently in Switzerland. I feel a little bit of a fraud in joining this debate because I haven't been in Bhutan for a number of years, but I have been in touch with my colleagues quite recently. And I was based in Kathmandu, in fact, not very far away, over the last 3.5 years. I had a lot of engagement in Bhutan in the past in advising, supporting the program of community forestry. So that's what I'll be talking about today.
Great, thank you both so much. I guess to kick us off, Wange, a question for you. What is the work that you're doing with the Gross National Happiness Commission, and how is it aimed to protect the most vulnerable in Bhutan? To accompany this, I'll be sharing my screen with a couple of slides that Wange prepared for us today, with a quick definition about G and H as well, to give us something all to work off with. Great. Is everyone able to see my screen all right?
Mm-hmm.
Great. All right. Wange, I think you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so well, basically to begin with, to a certain extent, well, to a certain extent, we address the needs of our vulnerable groups through our broad-based plans. Our plans have always been human-centered, and for instance, we continue to invest heavily in basic education and health, and provide free education and health, and also invest heavily in socioeconomic infrastructure, which all are geared towards uplifting the lives of the people. Then we also have the integration of GNH and SDGs into our development plans, and this leads to the development of inclusive national key result areas, which perhaps, if you have time, maybe later, I'll just give you a glimpse in my presentation. And these national key result areas, which are inclusive, then inform the formulation of our plans and programs. So there's this whole planning process, which at a broader level takes into consideration the needs of the vulnerable groups. Also, on the policy front, our policy formulation process requires the integration of GNH into all our public policies. Now, when we talk about integration of GNH and cross-cutting issues, there are issues such as equity, gender, climate change, and poverty, amongst others, which are included in a policy formulation process, so that all policies that are approved by the government are made inclusive. Now, since I've been talking about GNH, just to, if you look at the slide here, when I said national key result areas, we talk about these national key result areas have been formulated based on the sustainable development goals and also on our own cross-national happiness development paradigm. So we have integrated most of these international and national development goals to formulate our national key result areas. And these key result areas inform the development of our 5-year plans. So for instance, you could something very related to vulnerable groups is the reduction of poverty and inequality. And we also have equality of education and skills. And we also have a national key result area on gender equality. We also have those on carbon neutrality, climate, and disaster resilience. Now, with respect to perhaps, Anne, if I could just ask you to go to the beginning, just perhaps a quick definition of what GNH is.
Great. Here.
You'll be keeping track of time, right, Anne? So
yes, of course.
Okay, thank you. All right. Okay. For those who just, I'm sure most of the audience, you've come across this term, but for those who've just come across this term, well, it was a term that's been coined by our fourth king in the 70s, and this is where he was meeting a reporter, and he actually said that gross national happiness was more important than gross domestic product for Bhutan. So ever since, it's caught on almost become like and then has been accepted as and adopted as our development paradigm. It's basically a concept that puts the collective happiness of all people in Bhutan as the end goal of all the development policies and plans. And it's based on a multidimensional approach on the premise that meaningful development of the society can only occur when material and spiritual development occur together. What this does is it gives us an alternative measure of values where happiness levels of the people is actually valued. This takes, and again, when we measure it, we're taking it at the household level. So households become the unit of analysis, and it allows us to take stock of happiness of a household in terms of health, environment, psychological well-being, and other domains. So it basically gives us a measure of whether our development plans and policies are indeed meaningful. So quality of life becomes our primary metric, not GDP. GDP in this case just becomes a means to an end. GNH itself, we actually considered divided into 4 pillars, which is socioeconomic development, good governance, cultural preservation, and environmental conservation and preservation. And these 4 pillars are actually broken up into 9 domains. So these 9 domains are living standards, good governance, education, health, ecology, community vitality, time use and balance, and cultural and psychological well-being. Could you just okay, can skip, please. Okay, we can just stop here. So if you look at the 9 domains, the ones in green, there are 5 domains there. These are conventional domains which are used elsewhere around the world too, for development purposes. Are the ones in green. So those are living standards, health, education, governance, ecological diversity, and resilience. The ones that are blue are which are very context, which are specific to Bhutanese development, and these are things which we value as a part of our development agenda too. So which are things like psychological well-being, time use, cultural diversity and resilience, and community vitality. So our approach here as the government is, people always say that happiness is subjective. Somebody could be happy one moment, and the next minute he or she could be unhappy. So what can the government do? But our stand here is It's not our job to make people happy or not. Basically, what we are striving for is we consider these 9 domains as the minimum required for a person to be happy. So our job as the government is to create an environment where people can be happy. And once this environment is created, within that environment, it's up to the people themselves. But this is what we think is the minimum that's required, and that as the government, we are responsible for providing people. And we use
Great.
this. Okay, thank you.
Wange, I'll have to we'll make a shift really quickly to ask Jane. I was wondering, so the Helvetos Corporation has a long history, over 40 years, working with the Bhutanese government and with groups like the G&H Commission. I was wondering, how is your work in community forestry work towards the inclusion of women in Bhutan? And were G&H principles, like what Wange was talking about, integrated into this program? We also have a couple photos of your project, if you'd like us to go through those.
Okay, well, thanks, Anne. Maybe I can just begin by saying that, yes, indeed, Helvetos has been working with government of Bhutan right from the beginning, very much involved right from the start. So, and it was a very strong principle to work in harmony with the government. And then obviously when the G&H came in, then we took that on board fully. As far as the community forestry is concerned, well, forestry is very important to the government of Bhutan, always has been. The maintenance of the forest reserve, and there is a forest department which is responsible for that and is managing some forests more for production and others more for conservation. The idea of community forestry was brought in because it's recognized that local people depend heavily on forest resources for their livelihoods. So that doesn't mean just timber. I mean, of course, there is a need for timber for house construction and so forth, but it's much more all the other things. So fodder for the livestock, of course, fuel wood, deadwood, medicinal herbs, food products, etc. So to have access to those and to maintain the forest in a good condition, in a sustainable condition, it's great if local people are really involved personally in the management of the forest, because obviously the closer you're involved in taking responsibility, the more seriously you take the management for sustainable purposes. So actually, it was through a World Bank forestry project initially that, well, and also another EU project, that the concept of participatory forestry, community forestry was first discussed and promoted. And it was back in the late 2000s that I was involved, in fact, as a representative of, in fact, the Swiss government going and joining missions of the World Bank to see how this third forestry development project was actually operating in the field. And at that time, there was a lot of, I would say, caution. In fact, caution was the watchword on the behalf of the forest authorities in Thimphu as to handing over responsibility for forest management to local people, because they weren't sure that local people had got adequate knowledge to really manage forest on a sustainable basis. But the whole push was on getting forest management plans by the people who are actually using the forest, and having these plans then ratified by the authority in Thimphu, so that the management responsibility was transferred to the people, not the actual ownership of the forest. So I remember back at that time, I mean, it was, there was, as I say, a lot of caution, and we ended up, I think, with no more than 10 community forests. Then there was a change in the authorities, in fact, in the Limpo, the minister in Thimphu, and he was very keen that that community forestry should be promoted. And because there had been so much work done on working with the local communities, it was very quick to be able to forward all those management plans up to Thimphu and get them approved. And when I went back in 2015, I was amazed that there were already 600 community forests in the country, and there are now over 800. So really, there's been a big push in handing over responsibility, as I said, to local people. As far as women are concerned, I mean, there I really noticed in 2015 how the discussions were often with women. The most of the people coming to the meetings to discuss community forestry were women. And this was explained by the fact that increasingly young men in particular going out of the villages to seek work elsewhere in the country. Also, as far as Eastern Bhutan is concerned in particular, there is a system of matrilineal inheritance. So that means it's actually the women who are responsible for, I mean, they inherit the land and they're more responsible for farm work. Now we're having some photographs. That looks to me like, I think it's some community forest where we were discussing with a group of people. There's another picture there, which would show the people we were discussing with. We went, I mean, just to say, as far as this, going back to Bhutan in 2015, after a period of some 12 years is concerned, we went to a number of the oldest community forests that had been formed, to see how they had developed and what had changed and what the forest cover was like. And I mean, it was very obvious that the forest cover had improved, both in terms of the density of the forest and the species composition. So involving the people much more closely had a clear positive impact on the forest.
Great, thanks so much.
Pictures?
Yes.
Anyway,
a couple more here.
Yes, that was in Pemagatola. That was early on in the visit. I think that's Gatesville Community Forester.
Great. So there's never enough time, but we have one rapid fire question for both of you. First to you, Wange. This is a hard question to ask in under a minute, but in your experience, what have been the challenges of transforming GNH principles into concrete policy actions with the GNH Commission?
Okay, should I start? As I showed you in the slides earlier, with respect to integrating the conventional indicators, we are more or less fine there in some aspects, but it's more to do with the other softer aspects of GNH, which are very difficult to integrate into our plans. For instance, we have indicators for community vitality, time use, and say psychological well-being. And if there is some problems in those areas and we need to come up with some interventions, then these are not straightforward. For instance, on psychological well-being, we have been lucky in the sense the indicators are about whether you have positive emotions, whether you have negative emotions, and then if you have a lot of negative emotions, there's meditation, of course, where there's a proven science behind it. So there we have been lucky. But then there are other issues like those where interventions are not straightforward. So that's one challenge we face. Trying to actually pick up these indicators and come up with development programs. So that's always a difficulty. For instance, time use depends on how the amount you sleep, the amount you work, how do you strike a balance. Now, technology might be able to help there, but that's again something we lack. Then the other issue is, of course, resources. It's always an issue for us, for a developing country. We have competing needs, but resources are always limited. So those would be two of the most challenging aspects right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Wange. And Jane, really quickly, there's never enough time, of course, but we were wondering, with the move to community-led development with Helvetas, what challenges have you faced in the implementation of these projects?
I'm not sure it's a move towards community-led development. I think we've always done community-led development. So yeah, I know you were sort of thinking also about decentralization, because as you're aware, the government of Bhutan introduced democracy back in 2007, and with that has come the building of capacities at local government level. So Helvetas is also engaged very much in that. So there, it's really a question of, as I say, and supporting the capacities of local government, but then also supporting the capacities of people in managing community forests. So it all goes together in terms of really working at the local level, leading up to the national level. But I think there's just not enough time to deal with these questions.
Of course. All right. So now that we've had a very quick introduction to GNH, how it's applied within the GNH Commission, but also decentralized development, community forestry, and Helvetos uses these principles. We'll have to head to our second pair of panelists. But as we're kind of moving into this transition period, Halion, if I could ask, I'll end sharing my screen now here. Thank you so much, Wange and Jane. And we'll start the second Mentimeter set of questions here. And so really after kind of setting the foundation of these definitions and shared ideas of development, we are heading kind of in a different direction now. Our second pair speaking with us today will talk to us more about their experiences in reporting sustainable finance and starting entrepreneurial ventures. Kazmira and Tinley, are you all with us today?
Hi, yes.
Yes, hello. Great, all right. So now before we begin, we'll begin a really quick transitional exercise using Mentimeter yet again. If you could return back to Menti and use the code listed on the screen there, I'll share it within the chat. Thanks so much, Kalyan. And we really wanted to gauge again, what role do you think what role sustainable finance, entrepreneurship, other forms of value outside of the classical development paradigm play within these debates? It will just take a couple minutes for you all to join. And again, in answering these questions, there are no right or wrong answers. It's just to gauge the engagement here of our audience. We'll just give everyone next 45 seconds to add your answers. Great, thanks everyone. Very interesting series of reactions here. We can tell that there are a number of different understandings of these ideas, and we hope that our next pair of speakers will be able to illuminate their own experiences within these spaces. Tinley and Kazmira, if you both would be able to introduce yourselves to our audience. Maybe beginning with you, Tinley.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Tinley Choden. I'm a social entrepreneur, a travel entrepreneur, and consultant. I work within the ecosystem of climate action, youth activism, and entrepreneurship. I'm also the founding curator for Global Shapers Thimphu Hub and a climate reality leader.
I'll go next. So my name is Kazmira Jafford, and I'm a journalist and the editor of Geneva Solutions, which is a recently launched journalism platform based out of Geneva, and we cover activities of all the NGOs and the international community here in Geneva. So we kind of look at all sectors from climate change to sustainable business and finance to global health. Before that, I've been a business financial journalist for over 10 years, mainly in London. And I didn't always write about sustainable finance. That's kind of been an evolution over time as the sector as well has also gathered in importance. So that's me in a nutshell. Thank you.
Great. So I guess to really kick us off, the question I think on all of our minds is really, what is the role of entrepreneurship in sustainable finance during the climate crisis? I'll direct this question at you, Tinley.
Thank you, and I mean, you've seen some of the answers on the Mentimeter, but I would say it's vital and essential, especially entrepreneurship coupled with tech. They are disrupting and rising up to the challenges and opportunities of climate change. Climate crisis needs new systems and innovative ways of living, be it in terms of how you define it as business, governance, or lifestyles. And I would say entrepreneurship by nature, it's more tended towards a growth mindset that is open to learning. And I think when I say learning, it means both unlearning and relearning and staying relevant, which makes it agile and adaptive and responsive. It's also the problem solving attitude that is driven to find solutions and deliver actions while building a collective vision towards either the solution, the team building, and the followers. But I also saw one of the answers was distraction in the Mentimeter, which was a very interesting take on it. But I would hope it's a good distraction and not a bad distraction, and there's not a distraction from the main objective of addressing climate change.
Fascinating. And Kazmira, just in your experience of reporting on these issues of finance and sustainability, same question to you. What in your experience, how are issues of finance related to that of sustainable development?
Thank you for the question. It's really, financial markets are really, really crucial to this question. And they play a really important role when it comes to encouraging investment that is both beneficial for people and the planet, and and also mobilizing finance to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And investors and money managers, as custodians of wealth and of our wealth that belongs to us, have this important role in ensuring that investments serve to protect rather than harm our planet, and other key aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's also why we're seeing a lot of new regulation now, especially in Europe with the new green finance rules, to ensure that we don't have too much greenwashing, that make sure that financial market players disclose the risks and really clearly label what is sustainable or not, so people have a clearer idea of where their money is going. And so that's a part of what I've been trying to cover as well throughout my career at Geneva Solutions as well. And we've seen the finance sector really increasingly embracing the sustainability agenda over the past decade, but still there's far too little capital money flowing into the sustainable economy, and too much capital being allocated to a resource inefficient world. So you have the latest report from the UN Environment Programme with the University of Oxford showing, for example, that of the $14.6 trillion of money that's been allocated to the financial recovery from COVID, less than a fifth of that was going towards investments that benefit the planet, so green activities. So that's where we really need to see a change. And as a journalist, as part of our job to be kind of documenting that journey and reporting on that shift towards a more sustainable development growth.
Thank you so much to you both. It's helped us to tie these ideas and notions together. Tinley, in your career, you've started a number of social enterprises, from tourism to sustainable business, to putting the pieces together for Bhutan's first impact investment fund. What challenges have you faced as an active member of Bhutan's growing social enterprise ecosystem?
I mean, it's a bunch of challenges, and it's kind of hard to prioritize one over another. But if I can, just to help answer the question more coherently, I guess I would put it within the buckets of cultural, social, and finance. I think culturally, and that speaks a lot in terms of our society's attitude and historically what we have been. I think Bhutanese culture, traditionally, we're a very risk-averse society, and also historically, we transitioned from a farming community into a very bureaucratic, professional cadre. Back just a couple of even 10 or 15 years ago, the preferred job was to join the civil servant, and the private sector was not necessarily seen as the first option of job preference for people coming out of schools. And our values are captured in the GNH, which is very holistic and spiritual in nature. And it kind of leaves no space for a healthy discussion on sustainable business or on finance. Talking nonprofit is very welcomed and easy within our society and community. But when you talk about business or profit or talking about money is not necessarily a very comfortable conversation that many like to have. So it does create that cultural mindset attitude, and that is a barrier which is very difficult to pinpoint and address. Like how Wangya was saying earlier, if it's a psychological well-being, that's the issue. How do you design a project that has the right kind of intervention, because it's so complicated. So that's one bucket, I would say, in terms of the challenges. In terms of the social or the society bucket, I would say it's more around talent and marketplace. Bhutanese, we are demographically, we're largely a very young country. About 50% of our population is below the age of 27 years of age, sorry. And so it's a very young age, and also it's with the young population comes the kind of the passion and the idealism, but also we lack the experience and know-how and the exposure of that talent to the wider global trends and talents. But also in terms of our startup ecosystem, the marketplace, we are a country of 750,000. So if you're looking to build anything, if you're looking to scale anything, our marketplace is very limited. To begin with, the whole population is 750, and you divide that, say 50% has the purchasing power or has the kind of would buy your product, that already kind of cuts your market clients into half. That kind of really limits. So then it puts the pressure of basic economics. If your market is small, your price is high, your cost of production is high, and your product becomes not very competitive to other imports. Lastly, the third bucket, when it comes to finance, access to capital is a huge challenge here in Bhutan, especially for our private sector and in the startup ecosystem. A lot of the finance that is available right now, or the current tools of investment, is mainly debt through the banks and grant through the government or other bilateral and multilateral organizations funding scheme, and that's not necessarily the kind of capital you need when you're talking of a startup ecosystem, and you're especially talking of adding value and innovating and scaling. There are a few now, more and more in the last 5 or 7 years, there's been a number of growing small scale, sporadic seed funding, but that's very small. It doesn't necessarily address the issue of kind of scaling and helping a business grow. So I would say, those are the 3 large buckets of challenges that entrepreneurs face here in Bhutan.
Thanks so much, Tilly, for that insight, for us to learn more about the challenges you face, but also the environment in which these new ideas and ventures are growing. I guess, Kazmira, in your experience reporting on the sustainable finance and entrepreneurship related issues in Switzerland, have you found Switzerland to be a conducive environment for these ventures? Switzerland, of course, has a long history of traditional finance. What have you observed to be the environment for these economic ventures?
It's very varied depending on who you speak to and what sector you're covering, and who's telling the story. I think Switzerland's always had this kind of entrepreneurial mindset, but that's definitely, when you think of other entrepreneurial capitals, you don't often think of Switzerland, but for a small market, it does pull its weight. And you've really seen the entrepreneurial ecosystem grow and improve over the years. Some recent reports that we covered, for example, when you look at investments in the startup scene over the last decade, between 2012 and 2017, investment into the startup space kind of tripled, but you're still seeing challenges when it comes to very early stage funding. So that kind of 5 to 10 million franc range. Half of the country's startups are based in 2 cantons where the biggest universities are, so in Zurich and the EPFL in Lausanne. So the universities here are really, the hotbeds for breeding a lot of these startups. And there are some sectors where Switzerland is particularly strong, for example, in IT security and data and fintech and robotics. And then you've seen a real boom in clean tech, environmental tech startups. We recently covered a report from the Clean Tech Alps Association, which showed that investments in clean tech startups increased by a factor of 10 between 2016 and 2019, and that on average there were 13 new clean tech startups being created every year. And you're seeing a strong growth in financing with that. So obviously things have COVID has put a bit of a spanner in the works when it comes to that. But I think, if anything, COVID has shown how interrelated all these issues of climate and health really are, and shown how important it is to continue to invest in these young startup companies. And it'd be interesting to see what figures come out of the last year to see what the impact has been on the startup scene. It's really hard to tell at this point. So yeah, I think there's a really promising environment in Switzerland for startups. Then every company will have its own experience and story to tell about how difficult or not it's been to start a company here. I think, like Bhutan being a very small country, when you do start a business here, you automatically have to think about looking a bit more widely than just Switzerland, because otherwise you're kind of limited to quite a small market. And it's not the most competitive environment. So those are some of the challenges I've heard about. And also people, it's very, hiring people to join your startup is incredibly expensive here, given our high average wage. So that's a big barrier to entry for a lot of startups here.
Thank you both so much. I know that we're in this very rapid fire motion together, so we're going to move on to the last kind of section or pair of groups before bringing everyone back together. After Wange and Jane acquainted us with ideas of G&H and notions of sustainable development, Tinley and Kazmira introduced us very quickly to emerging notions of value and economic applications of that with startups and entrepreneurial ventures. Our last pair will be Sonam Deki and Silvano, who will be speaking to us today about the role of youth within these debates. But we'll begin, of course, again with a Mentimeter exercise that we'll share within the chat here with kind of one last set of questions. Colin, if you could share your screen. Great. And again, there are no right or wrong answers. As this is Sustainability Week Switzerland, a series of events organized by youth actors across the country. We really wanted to ask, what role do you believe youth plays in these debates and conversations? Let's just take a little while for you all to join, and then we'll just take a couple more seconds here. Great, we have some very interesting insights here about the role of youth in conversations and applications in mediating climate change. We'll begin with Sonam and Silvano Lager. Sona, if you could start us off and introduce yourself to the audience.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sonam Diki. I work as an environmental consultant on a few RGOB and ADB funded projects. My main, I guess, job in my my main role as an environmental consultant is to monitor air quality, especially in all these project sites. And I'm also a member of the Global Shapers Thimphu Hub, and currently the Youth Climate Ambassador for Global Youth Climate Network.
Then I think I'm going to go next. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today. It's been a delight to listen to all the stories that have been shared. My name is Silvano Liger. I am the Executive Director of Sentience Politics. Now, Sentience Politics is a political NGO in Switzerland, and we're working kind of with the Swiss direct democratic system with initiatives to push animal welfare projects connected to sustainability into the public domain, to have conversations about this on a national level, and also to actually make people vote on matters around this issue of animal welfare and sustainability. I'm also working with Collaboratio Helvetica, and I'm a catalyst there, kind of trying to foster systemic change, really, like connecting with all different stakeholders in the system. And I'm also a board member of the Global Shapers Hub in Zurich. So we have that in common. So then.
Thank you both. To start us off, Sonam, you're an environmental consultant, and in your work you monitor air pollution levels and ensure that building practices adhere to environmental standards. Why are these issues relevant to Bhutan specifically?
So I think, keeping in mind that Bhutan is a small landlocked country, and we have a very fragile ecosystem. If these building practices are not monitored, I think these ramifications of our actions could be very catastrophic. More than that, I think with poor quality of air also has a direct link to health. So if the air quality in Bhutan continues to deteriorate, it could have a really bad impact on the health for a lot of people. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to monitor the air. And if we, if I think if these building activities are left unmonitored, I think Bhutan could face a lot of long-term environmental degradations, which could give rise to a lot of natural hazards. We could face challenges with flooding and landslides, and even with acid rains. And I think the other reason why it's, I guess, important, at least from what I believe it's important to monitor air quality in these project sites, is also like we need to keep in mind that Bhutan is situated geographically between like the two largest economic giants in Asia, who have like really large population, as well as they are major contributors to pollution. And although Bhutan has been very blessed with pristine environment and clean air so far, there could be future challenges of that Bhutan could face with transboundary air pollution. So, and I think with this monitoring that we are doing currently with all of these activities, I think we can get an idea of what the current situation is and how much of the pollution is actually caused due to these activities or from these industries. And hopefully in the future, there could be a trend analysis of the data, and we could see the changes and the shift, and we could see the impact of the activities, and we can also see like how much of the pollution could be attributed due to the transboundary pollution. So I think these are the reasons why it's important, and I think keeping these in mind, our development policy of GNH has been very consistently and consciously like pursuing environmental sustainability along with economic growth. And hopefully keeping in mind that Bhutan does not face the challenges that most countries are facing today due to loss or degradation of their forest and environment, maybe due to policy oversight or due to the push for material and economic growth.
Thanks so much, Sonam. So on to you, Silvano. We're wondering, so with your work in sentience politics, you were talking about how you and your group are working towards an initiative to ban factory farming in Switzerland. What role do animal rights play within questions of sustainability and the climate crisis?
That's a good question. I want to reframe it a bit, maybe not talk so much about rights, because when we talk about animal rights, it's we think very like legally, and I think it has to be what has to be talked about is our relationship to animals and to nature as a whole. That's also kind of how it kind of impacts all of the other topics that we're looking at today. So when we talk about our relationship to animals, what we have to look at is food production mainly, because it's the biggest aspect. And there have been many reports on this, but most prominently recently was the Eat Lancet report in 2019 that basically said that food production as a whole is the largest cause of global environmental change. And agriculture, if we look at it globally again, occupies around 40% of global land. Food production is responsible for about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions and 70% of freshwater use, right? So that's all of agriculture. And that's a Swiss number now, but 85% of these emissions from agriculture, directly or indirectly, are connected to animal-based food production. So kind of the way that we use animals. And also very prominently in 2019, we all observed the forest fires in Brazil, and how it was a catastrophe for the people living there, so the indigenous cultures that lived there. And it was kind of driven by this need for me. That's why I think the GNH is such an interesting concept, because it drives us away from these kind of destructive behaviors that we use when it comes, for example, to burning down forests. And again, and I think that's important for people to understand, is why were these forests burned down? 90% of deforestation in the Amazon specifically can be connected to livestock, again, because we use these newly burned fields to build to grow animal feed, for example, right? So I think so that's kind of the first part, just looking at food production. And the second one is this is all inherently tied to a certain degree to a separation from nature, I guess, and the separation from humanity to others. You know, when we look at this from a perspective of justice, when we look at a sentient being being able to feel pain, for example, in our current economic thinking, we look at an animal automatically as a commodity, as something to consume, as something to use to a certain degree. And this also is tied together to the way that we look at nature, that we look at the river. You know, maybe if the river is going through an area that we don't want it to go, we kind of put it in another direction. So I think it's all kind of tied together, and yeah, so I do believe that what will evolve in the coming years is our relationship to animals, to nature, and it kind of has to, if we want to move towards a sustainable future that includes biodiversity, that includes you know, harmony between different species and healthy ecosystems. This will be a crucial aspect of it.
Thank you so much, Silvana. And I asked a question that we'd have for both of you. As people that are involved with the World Economic Forum's Global Shapers program, we were wondering what futures do you imagine for your respective countries, and what concrete actions can we take to get there? Does GNH play a role in this? Do laws that respect all life beings that in our relationship between man and nature? What role do these programs and these projects that you all are working on play within these futures? Let's begin with you, Sonam.
Thank you, Anne. So I think with the objective of GNH overall is very clear. That is a clean, sustainable future for Bhutan. And I think for that very reason, I think the Bhutanese can call the GNH a very version of sustainable development. But what kind of sustainable future do I see or envision for Bhutan? That too at a time where people's relentless need for the pursuit of material wealth often blinds the real goals of GNH. It might seem, or it might be a bit far-fetched or far-sighted in the immediate future. But considering our own limitations and keeping in mind that we are a least developed country, I would really like to imagine a future where Bhutanese are more into harnessing and using green energy. And my point being that I imagine a future where there are more maybe electric cars on our roads, where we switch to more organic farming. And how this might be possible is maybe there needs to be more awareness on it, because I think people right now are not very aware of what the benefits or the long-term benefits of switching to green vehicles could be, or organic farming could be. It could be beneficial not only for the country's economic growth, but also for the livelihoods of the people, for their health. And I think also in terms of education, I think the focus on STEM programs need to be improved. And when it comes to youth, I think we need to encourage youth to actively participate in and lobbying for these environmental conservations. So, yeah, thank you.
I mean, I can only build on that, especially the last part. I do believe that for Switzerland, involvement of youth is crucial. And when we look, so I work in politics, I'm always closely connected, for example, with the National Council in Switzerland. And when we look at parliamentarians under 30, I'm not sure, don't quote me on that. I think it's 4 or 5. You know, so like youth is not really represented in the most relevant political dialogue. And I think this needs to fundamentally change. There's a lot of engagement of youth in different groups, like Sentience Politics. I think our average age is 25 to the people working in our organization, so we're pretty young. And many NGOs in this field where they kind of like want to push, like where they want to switch the narrative, people are super young. And how do they engage with those people? How can they be taken seriously? So I do believe that it's a systemic thing that we need to look at, like in the political system in Switzerland. How do we change the system so that it doesn't have to be just renegade groups kind of trying to get attention by blocking streets or whatever, because that's what's currently happening. For Switzerland specifically, I do believe that we should absolutely have a leadership position when it comes to battling climate change. We do have the means, we have the resources, we have the science, we have everything really. What we don't have is the willingness to actually take on this role. So I do believe that we could be a leader in this entire conversation globally, and looking again at youth. What I do hope will happen, I think that's not just Switzerland, that's globally, is that we change the narrative. At the moment, youth are like Swiss youth are like the first generation in I don't know how long that cannot really imagine a future that is better than the present. So in the past, we always had something to look forward to, and at the moment, we simply don't have that. So I do believe that a new narrative is possible, a narrative that goes away from just avoiding a crisis, but actually creating something of value that we can look forward to.
Thank you so much, Silvano. We'll have to move on very quickly into kind of a group discussion very rapidly with everyone. We're just past the hour now. So Kazmira, Tinley, and Jane, if you could turn your video back on. Wanga unfortunately had to leave us this afternoon, but we really wanted to bring you all together for kind of one final question to round out our discussion today. We've talked about the role of different fields in environmental protection, in sustainable finance, in the protection of livelihoods of women, of decentralizing development, of sustainable finance, and where youth fit into this equation. What we haven't talked about, of course, is this panel's namesake, the crisis of value. And with that in mind, with the ongoing crises that we face, really wanted to ask you all, how can we bridge the gap between these different perspectives and understandings of what is important in our respective societies, but also our respective fields? And really, what concrete steps can we take to implement the changes needed to bridge the gaps between these perspectives? Jane, as we haven't heard from you in a while, we'll start you off with this very big question.
I think that's an absolutely huge question. But what I would definitely argue for is not sort of youth versus older people. I mean, I think what's really important is that there is intergenerational cooperation and understanding. Yeah? Just from a very personal perspective, when as a young person, I saw the big problem in the world as poverty. And my aim, my career perspective was to try and fight global poverty. Now, one can argue about whether one had the right perspective or whatever, but it wasn't that it was a selfish perspective trying to, I mean, against the climate, etc. I mean, all the values that we're talking about are absolutely values that I think many of my generation also hold. So it's a question of how we can all work together.
I'll pass the floor on to Tinley and then Kazmira. I guess we'll go in the same order.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I couldn't stress more what Jane said. I think it is intergenerational allyship is very important, and being inclusive. And I think, I know this word is thrown around a lot, but in the true sense, the empathy. I think being able to hear each other's story and tell your story from each other's perspective and understand it in a meaningful way. Because when it comes to values, a lot of the times the era or the time or the decade you grew up in influences a lot of what your values are. And today with the digital and the internet, the values are almost kind of like what Sonam said earlier, transboundaries, almost kind of, flowing back and forth in terms of what the traditional sense of value was, which was kind of encased within your country, your community, and you kind of live it. But now with global travel, the internet, and everything very global, being very global, and the influencers, that's we all have to kind of come, accept the reality that influencers, storytelling, all of that plays a huge role in influencing one's values. And I think that's where it comes, is that being able to communicate with each other effectively and truly understanding what the context, what the era we're living in, and the role that tech plays, and the whole the power of storytelling. That's from my side. So I think it's back to you, Kazmira.
Oh, it's a big question, and it's a really difficult one to take on. I don't know where to start, but I guess just bouncing on what Tinley just said and using the word empathy, I think we really underestimate the importance of emotions. We've seen and how that can lead to social mobilization and a change in social norms happening from like the bottom up. We saw it with like the movements of universal suffrage, and we're seeing it now. We're seeing a lot of anger, especially from younger generations, that they're not being listened to and that we're not taking action. And so I think it's taking that. I think we can also channel those emotions into a more collective and kind of, I guess, organized movement to change. And if that makes any sense, I think we need to kind of capitalize on those feelings at the moment and on this notion of empathy as well, and channel this into something that will actually change things for good in the future. And I was going to say something else and I've forgotten, but maybe that's a good place to leave it.
I'll pass it on to you, Silvana, and then we'll end with you, Sonam.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yes, it's a very big question, and it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time as well. So what I do believe is that, and it has been shared really, is that what we need more of is dialogue rather than discussions, like actually listening to each other, including people at the margins as well, like of a system, and like looking at it again from a systemic point of view, like, okay, so this is how the system works, this is the dynamic. And personally, I've engaged with, for example, in the food system in Switzerland, with discussions with people all over this system who completely oppose my views as well, right? And what I gathered is that we're actually not that different. And yet we kind of live in a society where polarization is so strong. It's stronger than ever, I think, fueled by social media again. So there's also a role of like, what kind of role does tech play in generating actually dialogue and creating spaces of connection and instead of polarization, right? So I think there's a big chance. And also just for us, creating maybe smaller spaces where actually these conversations can happen, where people with opposing views can come together and see the humanity in each other. And I think this is how this is kind of the only way for us to move forward.
I think going off of what Tilly mentioned regarding empathy and speaking, maybe since it's a large topic, I'll speak more from an environmental perspective. And similar to empathy, I feel for any kind of environmental conservation or sustainable development to be successful, I feel there needs to be firstly an attitude change, as well as there needs to be compassion, compassion towards the environment, because at the end, like, we have to realize that the environment is a very integral part of our lives, as well as for the economic growth. And to go off of what Jane had mentioned regarding intergenerational, I guess, difference or gap, I agree with what Jane said, but I think to avoid making the intergenerational inequalities wider, I think it is very important that youth play a big part in these decision-making processes, because we do have to keep in mind that the youth are going to be the youth are the future generations, and we will shoulder much of the long-term economic, environmental, and any form of social consequences. So yes, I think we all need to work together to build a sustainable future.
Thank you all so much for those insights across all of your different perspectives and fields. I guess we had one concrete question, was that, are there any concrete steps that you think can be taken within your organizations or communities to facilitate that kind of intergenerational, interdisciplinary dialogue. How about we start in the same order, beginning with you, Jane?
Well, in fact, I mean, yeah, I'm not muted. In fact, I think we already really try to be inclusive as an organization. So in any work that we do in the field, we really try to engage everybody. And of course, it's always people who are more at the margins, often women, but also people from perhaps an ethnic minority, people who are poorer, who don't have the time to come to meetings, such types of people who we really proactively try to engage. So I think it's never a question of just saying, oh, well, we open the meeting so anybody can come. It actually means that you have to make a proactive effort to make sure that everybody concerned is engaged. So that is in any case the way that we try to work. There's one thing actually I also wanted to share. It's a little bit going off the track, but as far as gross national happiness is concerned, Helvetus actually organized an exhibition on global happiness that's been shown in the Germanophone part of the country, but it will be starting in Geneva next month. I know, in May. So I'll just share the link for that for anybody who's interested.
So yeah, I guess I'm next in line. In terms of what concrete steps am I doing in my work here in Bhutan, I would say, my work with the entrepreneur ecosystem and the youth groups are some concrete examples, because I think by and large, the voices of these two groups are not necessarily heard or substantially included in the national discourse and action. And also, in terms of involvement of youth and youth's role in Bhutan, overall, as a society, we are not necessarily, because we became a democracy very new. We are in the third government, and we became a democracy in a very unique way as well. It was kind of from the throne rather than from an uprising from the community and dissatisfaction and anger from the larger population masses. So it was, we term it as a gift of the throne back to the people. So because of that, there is a lack of what you see in terms of activism and true democratic grassroots level activism that you see in some other communities and countries. And because of that, even with the young people, I think one of the challenges is kind of having how to self-organize and self-mobilize themselves and get their voices heard and become, and make their voice, amplify their voices. So my long-winded answer to your question is, my work with the Global Shapers Temple Hub, I think we are holding, we actually, in a week or so, we're holding a series of dialogues. It's called the Davos Lab Dialogue, and it's a Global Shapers Community International Initiative. But in Bhutan, we are talking on 4 topics, and going off of Silvano's comment on holding more dialogue, getting voices that are normally not heard, listening to voices that are normally not heard. So our 4 dialogues are mainly around climate change, around food systems, around youth activism and policy making, and on digital literacy. I think, Kazmira, you now.
Yeah, sorry, that was very interesting. I was taking that in. And constructive steps that we're doing, we try and ensure through our reporting that we're really representing and hearing different voices from all different generations and communities and ethnicities and different countries. So and we recently had a piece where we covered a youth activist summit in Geneva, where we had 2 voices in the piece. So we had Vanessa Nakate, who's the Ugandan Fridays for Future activist, and we had kind of her thoughts on bringing around climate justice next to Bertrand Picard, who's an entrepreneur. And so that's kind of one way. I'm losing my train of thought, but there's I think it's important. We have another thing is that a part of our philosophy is solutions journalism. So we can't do it with every single piece, but we try and incorporate this idea of solutions or constructive journalism through our reporting, so that we're not just reporting on the problems, but also how we can go about trying to solve those problems and what's working and what's not working. And looking at things that have been put in place, say 3 to 5 years ago, and evaluating those and saying, okay, what can we learn from this? So I think that's a constructive step that we're taking through journalism to try and bring about change and hopefully inspire others to mobilize change as well.
Thank you. Some inspiring insights from all of you. I guess, so for me, when not even just talking about sentience politics specifically, I do believe that in order to engage in these dialogues, we have to go beyond our own, beyond an organization, just as a unit basically, and go more systemic, and then even more across sectors, multi-stakeholder, and really engage the system and understand the system. And I think also shift our perspective from I am this person, I have this job, I work this specific thing. No, but I'm part of this ecosystem. I have to understand how does the system work in order to create meaningful change. So it's not just, so for example, if we just make an initiative, which we do sometimes, we kind of throw that in the system and the system will react to it, right? But whereas if we sit down with people and actually see, okay, where are the struggles, we can actually co-create something that is held by the system and is actually sustainable because it's going to be maintained. So I think creating these spaces, which is something we're starting now, we haven't done yet, but something we're starting now, I think is extremely meaningful, and and the way to move forward for us.
Sorry, I had lost everyone for a bit. I have a little bit shaky internet, but I guess to go off of the last I heard was what Tine said, and I think it would be, mentioning the Global Shapers dialogue, the Davos dialogue. I think it would be on leveraging on the power of technology. I think that is one aspect we could see, change, like the steps that we could take as an institution or as an organization in our fields and societies. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Sana. Looks like we have the chance for one question from our audience. So from Manfredo Radcati, he asked, what are the chances of GNH being adopted by other countries, and which countries are more likely to adopt these measures in their national accounts? I'm going to reframe this question a little bit so that you all can have a chance to answer it. Is how our more holistic development measures or understanding of value, like GNH, do you think that those measures are being integrated into a wider number of fields, into a wider number of countries? And do you think that these sorts of concepts are catching on more largely in the international landscape? Let's mix it up and maybe start with you, Kazmira. In your experience reporting within Switzerland or in International Geneva, have you seen notions like GNH or other development measures catch on?
On a country level, I think there's a lot of pressure on countries, governments worldwide to kind of look kind of beyond GDP and this notion of value. I can actually comment on a report that came out recently by the United Nations Development Programme. They have this report that's been going for 30 years called the Human Development Report. And they actually use, instead of using growth in GDP as the sole measure for development, they look at, they measure countries by their human development. So whether each country have the freedom and opportunity to live the lives that they value. And so I think this index is interesting, actually, if you have a chance to have a look, because it kind of speaks, when I read about it, I was like, this is kind of resounds with the gross national happiness index. And it's interesting. And this year they factored in, they looked at, if you take the environmental factors into account, where does that put development? And you can imagine that obviously the score came in very low, and that no country is making any progress in terms of development if you take into account the carbon footprint, for example, and yeah. So that's what I've seen in terms of reporting from a UN level rather than a country level.
How about Tinley? Have you seen G&H principles kind of coexisting harmoniously with entrepreneurship and the startup ecosystem in Bhutan?
Yeah, I have. And I think the whole social enterprise movement and the whole impact investment movement in terms of value alignment is very similar to the G&H principles. And to the question of what country is adopting G&H and if it's being of interest globally, I think academically there's been a lot of interest in G&H just because that's what the academics do, is a lot of intellectual stimulation and alternative models, and you kind of like discuss, debate, and research about it. But in terms of how, if other countries have adopted G&H principles, I would say in terms of the principles, I see similar things even in Thailand and in some other counties in the US. I speak of US just because of my experience there. I've seen like small county level governments adopt similar values that have been inspired by G&H. But I think when it comes to the actual application and implementation, it's very culturally context, right? You have to look at it from within where that community or the society's cultural context is. Because in G&H, if you look at it from the Bhutanese perspective, it's highly influenced by Buddhist values. Again, now when I say Buddhist values, it doesn't necessarily mean religion. It means more principles and values that are inspired by the Buddhist philosophy. So therefore, you have for G&H, the Bhutanese G&H model, it kind of landed very easily on the people when the king pronounced it in the 1970s, because it's very highly aligned with our cultural values. But I've seen, in other countries and other businesses, as well as communities and groups adopting these principles. But I would say in terms of the entrepreneurship ecosystem, the whole movement on social entrepreneurship, meaning looking at the triple bottom line, whether you call it as society, environment, and prosperity, or whether, even in terms of impact investment, when you look at patient capital, when you look at, accounting for your investment beyond just profit maximization, the kind of impact you create, the matrix you measure to measure your ROI. So I think there is more recently in the last 5-10 years, a lot of push towards that because the traditional systems of polarity, meaning like for-profit and non-profit, is not sustainable independently. You kind of have to meet each other in the mid-ground.
Thanks so much, Tinley. It looks like we're just now out of time. We've already reached the end of our very rapid fire session today. 1 hour and a half passes by quickly, of course. And I just to round us out, if we could take everyone through just one quick round of closing statements, and if there is any concrete advice that you would give to youth actors moving forward across these different fields, what would you advise them? And thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. And I'll pass it on to, let's go in the opposite order this time, beginning with you, Sonam.
Sorry. Thank you. And this was really interesting listening to all the speakers and their insights. As mentioned earlier, I think if I had to give one advice, it would be, compassion. To be successful, like we do need to be compassionate towards each other and towards the environment. Yeah. Thank you.
I guess that's me next. I hope you can hear me. I guess what I would advise to youth actors is to listen, to don't focus on being polarized, don't hate the enemy or whatever. There are no enemies, basically, and have hope that actually something better is possible, and we're not just averting a crisis. We can actually create something that is better than what we currently have.
My 2 cents on that is keep learning, act, your voice counts, be inclusive, be entrepreneurial, be passionate, take care of yourselves, work as a team, reach out to each other.
I think sustainability is about the future. Sustainable development is about the future. And when you read a lot of the headlines today, it's important. It's easy to think that it's already determined and defined for us, and to despair at some of the very anxiety-driven headlines. But nothing is set in stone yet. So we need to take that narrative and rewrite those headlines for a more positive future. And that's what people can do.
Yes, I'd also echo that. Try and stay positive and look for commonalities. It's surprising how many commonalities we can actually find. In fact, as Svano said, often it's not the enemy. There are many things that we can find where we can agree upon. Let's try and work with it towards those. It's in nobody's interest if the planet ends up frying. I shouldn't laugh about that.
Thank you all so much. We hope that in this short 1 hour and a half conversation, we've been able to create a conversation about shared definitions of ideas of G&H. We hope that you've learned something about the different contexts and fields that factor around the questions of sustainability and the different and how to bridge across those different perspectives. In fact, we hope we've learned today that perhaps it's not so much a crisis of value, but perhaps a crisis in language and understanding across difference. We'd love for you guys to join us at other events at Sustainability Week Switzerland. Thanks so much for taking a bit of time out of your afternoon, your evening, your morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Anne, and thanks to everybody else.